are a little bit late, but thank you so much for coming. Can you all see the slides? Can you see the slides?
Yes, see the slides.
Brilliant.
Yes, I see the slides as well.
Brilliant. Okay, I'll get on and start then. Actually, that's better, isn't it? Like that. Is that better for everybody? You can see that now.
Yeah, that's better.
Brilliant. Okay, so for everybody who's attended these before, thanks again for attending this session. This is a sort of process that we're going through where I'm creating evidence for a new knowledge base for organisational change. And we've got a session next week on the neuroscience of organisational change. Apparently you've got 2,000 people turning up for that one, which is amazing. And we've got another one in August, which sort of summarises where we've come from and presents a new sort of approach to building capability to help organisations change. And that's on the 3rd of August. And then what I've also started doing in parallel is, as I've gone through building this capability, this new knowledge base, I have started deep diving into some of the theory behind the various different capabilities that I feel organisations need in order to create change capability. And so I'm running these sessions. We ran a session on trusting leadership. This one is in fairness and decision making. We've got another one, psychological safety, in a couple of weeks, and then moving on to organisational support and relationships. So if you do attend the building capability for organisational change session, you'll get to see how all of this fits together. And this is the sort of preliminary view of the model. It contains 16 different capabilities. And one of those key capabilities is fairness in decision making, which is what we're going to talk about today. And I won't go into this model in detail because we'll be going through that in the building capability session in August. But what we can see is that when I've run this model in organisations, and part of my change capability consulting work, I assess organisations against those 16 different capabilities. And this looks quite a complicated sort of model, but you can see the complicated interrelationship there is between all these different facets of organisational change. And what the size of these little blocks, so you can see fairness here, the size of these blocks mean how important they are to employees, so they get to vote. Yes, fairness is important. It gives the organisation a score on how good their levels of fairness are, and then it gives a correlation between fairness and lots of other factors. So you can see on the right hand side of the screen, the simpler diagram, you can just see fairness is highly correlated to the support that organisations give employees through change, levels of accountability, levels of leadership, and safety. And so this is really useful for organisations because they can say, right, we're pretty good at fairness. Everybody in the organisation seems to be saying that it's something that we should be focusing on. But if we want to improve, say, job design, because we know that's important, or we want to improve development, we know that fairness has a high correlation with those capabilities as well. So through fairness, we can start to drive, development opportunities, leadership capability, etc. So this is how I use the model, and this is how we can get down into the detail of kind of what's important. Sorry. And from that, I've sort of built this model of fairness, which is also based on the evidence that we're going to review today, which is all the various inputs into fairness and what that might mean in reality. So is there, fairness in training and support? Is there fairness in drives trust in leadership? It underpins relationships with managers. It gives people a feeling of voice and how important psychological safety is to that. So we'll go through these different relationships, and this is all borne out by the evidence which we're going to touch on today. Sorry, I'm going to skip this slide. I thought I'd hidden that. So what we're going to go through today is why is fairness important in decision making? What is it, and how does it work? And please chip in if you have any questions as we go through this. If you want me to stop and dive a little bit deeper, but I'm just going to keep going through these slides. So why is this so important? I'm going to go through each of these individual points. I mean, there is lots of evidence. It's so important for organisational change because it helps people go the extra mile. So it creates the energy needed within organisations to be able to execute change. It offers a great balance, a great way of balancing this dilemma that we find within organisations and change around how much autonomy do we give people in decision making and how much structure do we put around decision making. It creates inclusive cultures because it gets this balance right between autonomy and structure. It allows people gives people voice and the ability to express themselves during change whilst offering structure and a sense of belonging. And it helps to reduce uncertainty and ambiguity as well. And we know how much of an energy sapper that can be, and it can stop people from engaging in change initiatives if they think that everything is too uncertain and things are ambiguous. And we also know from the evidence, so this is a survey that I ran back in 2018, had about 350 responses from change practitioners, and I just asked them what the most important factors were in change. And they're saying that you can see here, fair change process was one of the highest scoring ones. And in fact, they're sort of agreeing with academics. So you can see the academics rating there is it's likely to be true that fair change process is important for change. And we know also that practitioners are saying that it's likely to be important as well. And you can see here that this book here by 10 Have Reconsidering Change Management, which I'd advise everybody to buy and read, comes out as sort of number 7 in their ranking of what is really important for organisational change. And you can see here, this is the amount of research that's got into organisational justice, as it's called by the sort of academics, and we'll be calling it organisational fairness. And you can see all the way up to 2018, sort of an exponential rise in interest in this area. And it does help to balance this paradox of autonomy and structure. And you see this idea dating back in organisational change right to the original theories around organisational change and development back in the 60s, where people were writing about how do we create this sort of sense of ownership and individuality within change and uniqueness, and keep change sort of emergent and responsive to individual needs, whilst having a sort of a planned approach, some sort of rigid processes that people are having to follow, because we don't want to sort of descend into sort of chaos. Organisations tend to be hierarchical, so how do we give sort of self-organising aspect that we need for emergent change whilst keeping the hierarchy? So this is a real dilemma, and I've written about this, and you can read about my posts on this in LinkedIn. And it's also, I think it also underpins what are called organisational citizenship behaviours, and there's lots of research into this and the connection between organisational justice and how people interact with other people. So if we have fair processes, we find that people help each other out, they're more fair and generous with their time, they're more loyal to the organisation, they comply. So I guess in organisational change speak, this is really important for encouraging participation and reducing resistance to change as well. And people exhibit these sort of citizenship behaviours when they perceive organisations to be fair. And again, this comes down to this starting principle within organisational change, that you have to have the energy within the system to be able to create change. There's no point in going into organisation and asking them to change, or individuals to change, if people are weary and tired of previous changes, or they don't feel that, for instance, there's a fair decision-making process or whatever. The change initiative won't go very fast, which is why building these capabilities is so important. And this is one of the characteristics of complex systems, and we know organisations are complex systems as well. This balance between getting organisations sort of dynamically organised, or being agile, where you've got sort of variable relationships. I could be working with one person one day and another the other day and the next day. And the sort of hierarchies, which we know organisations and complex systems tend towards a hierarchical structure. And you can see there organisational justice is so important in sort of mediating or getting that balance right. And it's also really important for controlling sort of group dynamics. So there are benefits. There's an upside of having very dynamic groups. You know, you get this sort of collective intelligence. You get social facilitation, allows individuals to build strong bonds, etc. But at the same time, you know, you do see social loafing. You get into this sort of group think. You know, you get the sort of if the groups are too large, then people tend to lose their relationships. And you can see sort of information hogging as well, where there are sort of power dynamics going on. And particularly procedural fairness, which we'll come on to, again, can help get this balance right when people have a clear idea of what is fair treatment of individuals and what is a fair process. So that's the why it's important. Are there any sort of any questions, thoughts on that?
You went through it fairly quickly, but most of the stuff that you said there made logical sense, I thought, as you were going through it. I like the organisational justice comments that you were putting in and the links back to psychological safety. That kind of like all fits together as you say it.
Brilliant. I'm glad I'm making sense, Andy. But remember, as I always say on these sessions, I mean, there's lots of references to research here. So please go away and read around it yourself. But you're absolutely right that, you know, increasingly I'm sort of feeling, and our next session is on psychological safety, that psychological safety is a bedrock of lots of capabilities that organisations, you know, need in order to be able to change. And ultimately, you know, if you can't be open and honest in your opinion about how you think the change is going, or how it's impacting you, or how it's impacting the organisation, then there's kind of that's got to be the starting point, hasn't it?
It's a bit of a wall if you can't do it, isn't it, really?
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks, Annie. Okay, so I'll carry on. So what is it? So this is, you know, the idea of organisational fairness has been around since the 60s, and originally it you know, it's thought of as quite transactional, that if people's pay and conditions weren't fair, they would start to get frustrated and annoyed. So the idea of fairness came from this idea of are the rewards properly distributed? So we get this idea of distributive fairness. So are the outcomes of decisions fair? And that's where it started with Adams and others. And then it sort of moved on to, well, so and that was sort of more of a reactive approach to fairness. So, okay, so how are people reacting to the outcomes? But what's the sort of what process did we go through in order to get to that outcome? If that outcome wasn't seen as being fair or, you know, beneficial to people, then what's the process that we go through? So then we had this idea of procedural justice, which starts to come round during the 1970s. And I feel, even though there isn't reference to it in these various papers, but you can see there Gowder's idea of reciprocity, which is so important. This idea that fairness is actually generated from an idea of, well, it's not fair because I'm giving more than I'm getting, which is fundamentally what distributive justice is about, and procedural justice as well, that if I'm not participating in the process, or I'm not clear of what the process is, then it's more likely you're not going to get the balance right between what I've put in and what I'm getting out, i.e. fair pay, for instance. And then during the 80s, we had this idea of you know, that actually, if we're participating in the process or procedural justice, if we're participating in the process, then that's about consulting with people. So then it becomes an interpersonal and interactional sort of justice. So how do we encourage people then to start participating in the procedural justice? So you can see this sort of nice evolution from a fairly functional view of justice through to more of a sort of socially constructed view of fairness, i.e. it's about the sort of interactions that we have and what we decide as an organisation or as a group that is fair. And then then people started to think, well, it's about social exchange. If it's socially constructed, it's about you know, how much am I putting in, how much am I getting out, which goes back to sort of Gowder's idea of reciprocity. And also at that time we had Greenberg, who was sort of really trying to nail down the definition of what this meant, what this construct was. And once all that was kind of sorted, we get these great meta-analysis coming out, which is a culmination of loads and loads of research that's been done for people actually to say, right, well, now we understand what it is and we've defined it. We've done lots of research. What does all this research tell us? Which is what we're going to go into today. And then during the 2000s, all that meta-analysis then sort of links back to this idea of the linkage between social exchange theory and fairness. And then I think there's a broader question that all of this research is kind of based on, is it based on out-of-date ideas of what it means to be an employee and what employees expect in return in terms of job security, in terms of working from home? You know, what is a job? What is a career? And so there you can see papers starting to come out now around, well, are we basing our assumptions on the right sort of foundations that have essentially come from the 60s, where they had a different relationship with work? So I think it's quite an interesting area and one to keep following, and I think it offers us a lot in terms of how we should be moving forward. So as I sort of mentioned, you know, the idea of justice, you know, is socially constructed. So it's whatever the organisation perceives it to be, and you can imagine this varies across culture. If you go and work in different parts of the world, ideas around justice and what's fair treatment of people will vary enormously, and it will vary within organisations as well. So it's not something that you can just go into an organisation and apply. You have to go in and understand what people feel is just within their environment. Sorry, I'll skip over that because we touched on that. So what is it? We touched on these different types of fairness. So the first part is this sort of procedural fairness. So what is a fair process? So how do we get to an outcome that is fair? What procedure are we following? Is that procedure written down? Is it clear? Is it explained to everybody? Has everybody signed up to it? Because if it's not, if the procedure isn't clear or the procedure isn't seen to be fair, then it's unlikely that people will sign up to the outcomes. And the outcomes are this distributed fairness. So are the outcomes fair? Is the pay fair? Is the outcomes of the change fair? And what we find, what the research is quite clear on, that tells us quite clearly is, sorry, this is on automated, is that even if the outcomes are not fair, even if I'm potentially going to be made redundant as part of this change process, as long as the procedure that we've been through to get to that outcome is fair, then I'm more likely to go along with the change, which is interesting because people are willing to kind of sacrifice themselves in a way for the greater good, which is a nice way to think about, you know, the idea of what's in it for me versus what's in it for us. And actually people are more, well, what's in it for us? I can see how this is a fair process and it's fair for most people. Okay, the outcome hasn't benefited me, but the process seems to be fair and it seems to be transparent. And sort of encasing all of this is, what process have you been through to talk about what is procedurally fair and what outcomes are potentially fair? And this is about how people feel they're treated. It's about these interpersonal and informational elements of organisational justice. And I think this, you know, these sorry, this is annoying because it's these different areas procedural justice and distributed justice give structure to the organisation. So if the procedure is clear, there's a clear structure around how we make decisions, which we know drive job satisfaction and commitment to organisational change. But at the same time, we want to give people agency over what those decisions are, which is the interpersonal and informational elements of fairness. So this gives us this balance between how do we get people feeling autonomous and feeling as though they've got a say, which is the agency part, and how do we give it structure at the same time. So I think organisational fairness is a nice construct to get that balance right. And we'll come on later into how interpersonal and informational relationship have different outcomes to procedural and distributed relationship, which relate back to this agency and structure. And I think there's a nice sort of checklist here of how we can get fairness in decision making. And this comes from a paper that was written a few years ago, but it gives the idea that are the decisions consistent? So this is procedural consistency. So are we following the same process to get to those decisions? Is there any sort of bias in the decision making process? Do we think that someone's making decisions for their own self-interest, for instance? So are the decisions seen to be impartial? How accurate are they? How good are the decisions that you're making? Because the likelihood is the less consultation, the less evidence you brought to the table, the more bias there is or the less bias there is in the decision-making process, the better the decision's going to be. And we know from the leadership session that I ran that consistency and accuracy are so important for building trust in leadership as well. Consistency in behaviour and quality or competency of decision making. So if people are seeing sort of sporadic or erratic decisions being made based on very little evidence, then that certainly is going to start undermining trust and start undermining people's belief that the organisation is genuinely trying to change, or the change is genuine. Quite an important one, correctable. So if we are going to try something and we've never done it before and we're not really certain of the outcomes, can we go back? Can we correct the decision? And do we have a process in place for correcting decisions or understanding why they went wrong? And I'll go into a mechanism or a method that you can use to do that. And is it representative? Has everybody been sort of consulted? Well, not everybody, but interested groups or people who are interested in that decision, or that decision will impact on them. Have they been consulted? And is it ethical? And in terms of interactional justice, I think these are the four areas that you need to look out for. So is the information realistic? Is it accurate? Presented in an open manner, which we know drives sort of accuracy. So are the questions that are being asked sort of the right sort of questions, and do they have connotations of sort of prejudice or someone's mind already being made up as to what the outcomes are? Is it done in a respectful way? And you see this a lot in employee engagement surveys. Am I treated with respect and dignity? And I think that's so important for this interactional justice, that people feel they're dealt with in a courteous, dignified manner, particularly when organisational change is going to fundamentally change their relationships, or there is sort of redundancy or whatever it is. And when mistakes are made, again, what process do we go through to try and rectify those injustices? And we'll come on to, as I mentioned, a method for that. So my sort of definition of organisational fairness is just a process where people feel the decision-making process consistent, is accurate, unbiased, and transparent. And the outcomes are equitable, and that their voice has been heard. So I thought now we just move on to some practical elements of how we can make organisational fairness work in a sort of change scenario. So does that all make sense? The four different types of organisational justice. Have I lost people? Yep, thumbs up from Simon. Thank you. Great. I'll carry on. So how are we going to make this work in practice? So that's a sort of the theory, as it were, touching on some, I guess, useful checklists that you could use to make sure that decisions are fair. So these are the 4 different types of fairness that we've talked about, and this is a model that Colquitt came up with in 2013, and Colquitt has been leading on all the research really around organisational justice, organisational fairness. And so he suggests that fairness kind of works through this idea of social exchange. So remember when we were talking about the history of organisational fairness, that this idea of social exchange goes back to Gowder in the 1960s, that people have a sense of reciprocity, that they expect to get back what they kind of put in. And that determines the level of trust. It obviously determines the level of commitment that people have to the organisation and change, because if I think I'm putting in a lot and I'm not getting a lot out, I'm likely to pull back on my commitment. And it obviously drives organisational support, and management support also mediates levels of fairness. And levels of fairness also have a very big impact on emotional side of people working as well. So there's the sort of behavioural side and the emotional aspect. And if I feel hard done by, that's something that can really get quite a strong emotional reaction from people if they feel that injustice. For most people, I'd imagine it's probably the biggest reaction that you'll get. If they feel that there is an injustice, then you'll get very strong emotional reactions. And both of these things then drive the behaviours that we see from fair decision making, which is improvements. If there is fair decision making, we see that it drives task performance. We see that it creates these organisational citizenship behaviours, which we talked about. You know, where you help your colleagues out, and you contribute to the organisation, and it diminishes counterproductive work behaviour, which could be in our case resistance to change. So fairness works through, or is what's called mediated by social exchange and the emotional effect that it has to create these behaviours. And as I mentioned, the different elements of justice have different impacts. So procedural and distributed justice will impact on performance, organisational commitment, trust. Sorry, I mentioned performance twice there. So it will drive the relationships that we have, organisational support, the relationships with their leadership and performance, and informational and interpersonal justice will have an impact on how committed I am to change my organisational citizenship behaviours. If I don't feel that I'm being included in the decision-making process, then I might withdraw my support for various other organisational initiatives, and will drive down my level of satisfaction with my supervisor as well, or my manager. So it reduces levels of accountability, undermines relationships, and makes and stops people from being adaptable to change if we can't get this informational interpersonal elements right. And I just thought I'd put this in as well, because this is research around what do we mean by treating people with dignity and respect in organisations, and what do we mean by, what is bullying, what is being uncivil to people, i.e. not exhibiting organisational citizenship type behaviours. And I thought it was interesting that bullying is actually defined as a situation where individuals are repeatedly exposed to negative acts. So if you think about this in terms of organisational change, in fact, if you keep on repeating things that aren't working for the organisation, or the organisation keeps going through, redundancies or whatever it is, then or is not being, or people feel that they're not being consulted, or information is being withheld from them, then these are all forms of bullying and incivility. So not only is the change management process going wrong, we're actually potentially undermining the integrity of the organisation, or the sort of fabric of the organisation, as it were. And yeah, one of the key in the research, one of the key areas that people perceive to be sort of bullying behaviour by organisations is withholding information, particularly if it affects their performance. And also, I guess, what could come with change and what comes with these organisational citizenship behaviours. We talked about this sort of energy for change. Am I willing to go the extra mile? Well, change is normally associated with increasing workload and potentially sort of tough deadlines. And people will absorb that if they feel that there is justice within the process. If they don't feel there's justice in the process, as we know, they're less likely to exhibit discretionary behaviour, and so they're more likely to feel that they're being bullied and pushed into situations that they don't agree with. And I also thought on the bullying front as well, that actually one of the key triggers from the research is telling us that restructuring, organisational changes and changes in management are key triggers for people to perceive bullying in organisations. And you can imagine, if you're going through an organisation, if you're going through a restructure or an organisational redesign, that when those relationships start to become weaker because people are moving into new areas or whatever, then that sort of undermines those organisational citizenship behaviours and could be a trigger for people getting annoyed and frustrated and starting these sort of bullying behaviours. But that they only sort of appear through these enablers, which again, the enablers of bullying are perceived power imbalance, for instance. So if people aren't allowed to participate in decisions, then that's essentially could potentially be an enabler for bullying, because people aren't having their views represented and aren't having a say in the change. So yeah, I just thought that was an interesting take on the sort of duty of care that we need to have as change practitioners when we are implementing change. So I thought I'd just go through this. Science for Work, if you go to their website, which is scienceforwork.com, they have this great diagram, which I'm going to go through now, which sort of talks you through what is fair enough. So what could potentially be seen as being unfair or fair. And this goes through a nice process that I imagine you've faced in your careers, whether you have been subject to change or whether you are a change practitioner. But it kind of starts off with, how do we help people through the change process? And, the first thing is, an organisation might announce that there are going to be job cuts, for example. So this is the distributed justice side of change. So it's going to hit me hard. It's going to hit my team hard. I might lose my job. So we start to worry and we are anxious. But then we start to or the organisation starts to dial up the procedural justice side, which is, okay, so how do I have an input into that? What is the process for applying for, say, other jobs in the organisation, or is the organisation going to help me when I do leave the organisation? So what is the process that the organisation is going through to try and make this as fair as possible? Are decisions challengeable? So if I find that there isn't a position for me, or our team is being sort of disbanded, is there a formal way in which I can challenge that decision, which is what we talked about in terms of one of the checks in place for ensuring that the procedures can be challenged and corrected. And then we get this sort of informational side, which is, we're being told what the benefits are and the new opportunities coming through the organisation, and we start to really see that the leaders are being genuine and authentic in what they're trying to do, and that this is the best way to do it, etc. And we start to feel this sort of interpersonal sense of justice as well. So I just thought, I'm not sure how good this scenario is, but I just thought it was a nice way of explaining how the different elements of justice come into play potentially through a change process. I mean, I would reverse this, I think, and start with the informational and interpersonal, and actually start with, well, we've actually got this problem. What's the solution going to be, rather than jumping to the solution, i.e. budget cuts, or but anyway, hopefully you get the idea of how this works in practice. And one of the key elements of this, which is a kind of another construct but supports informational and interactional justice, is this idea of giving voice to people. And there's loads of stuff here from CIPD on how you can give voice both at a group and an individual level. And CIPD are very keen on this idea of voice, particularly after Black Lives Matter movement and COVID, and lots of change in organisations. How do we actually give people voice, particularly when people are working remotely, and give them that sort of sense of belonging? And they define voice as being the ability of employees to express their views and opinions and influence decisions. But it's interesting, the research that they show suggests that people don't feel that actually influence in decision making is part of giving employees voice. And managers actually feel that giving employees voice is just another channel for communicating, which it isn't. So when you go into organisations, I think it's worth explaining what we mean by voice and interactional and informational justice, and how that can be improved in the organisation to improve the change process or build that capability. And as we mentioned, psychological safety is a bedrock of giving voice, being very clear on what channels and what messages, and not confusing those messages, getting congruence in the change, making sure that you're sort of building the values and the citizenship and sort of behaviours around voice as well. How do we treat people with dignity and respect? What do we mean? What are the potential pitfalls? So we can build this sort of sustainable voice. And ultimately, it ties into diversity and inclusion as well, and creates an inclusive culture where everybody feels that they're part of the change process. And obviously, sort of gives you some insurance against issues around bullying behaviour as well. So the takeaways for practice, I guess, are the process. Is the decision making transparent? Are people allowed to be given input? Is the decision correctable? Do you seek diversity of opinion? What the outcomes are? So are the resources distributed fairly? Are the outcomes seen to be equitable and fair, even though they don't benefit the individual, which is that scenario that we talked through? And are people treated according to their individual needs as well? And in terms of information, is it clear how decisions are made? Do we have a process? Is it clearly communicated? How do people get voice within that process? And ultimately, how do you treat people with dignity and respect? And I thought these were some nice takeaways as well from Science for Work, which gives some areas. So consider the context. So we know, because justice is sort of socially constructed, we need to understand what it means in that organisation, so we're not extrapolating from other organisations, which then makes sure decisions that you make sort of bias, which is against the sort of principles of fair decision making. Making trade-offs mindfully. So I think this comes back to this idea around social exchange. If fairness is about I get in what I sort of take out, that's fair, then what you put in and what you take out, you have to think about that quite mindfully, and what that means to different individuals when you're negotiating change in an organisation. Don't make assumptions, communicate, and this is about our ability within change to be able to listen and to really convey and I guess reflect back on what we think people are telling us, to make sure that we're 100% clear and not jumping to any potential solutions or being biased by our various cognitive biases that we have. And this last one here, which sorry. Okay, I'm going to skip that last one because I can't remember what the golden rule is, but I'll come back to that. And this is a model that I use for organisations in terms of how they can construct their decision-making process. There are certain decisions that people just need to comply to, that there's very little room for manoeuvre, very little room for people to have input. They're high impact, high risk. There's a certain sense of certainty about what will happen if we don't get this right. So this could be diversity and inclusion kind of issues. It could be duty of care issues. It could be safeguarding. It could be financial. We do have to comply to these government regulations, and people understand that, and there becomes more of a telling people this is what we're going to do. Obviously, you can think about the framing of the message, etc., but there's no negotiation around that. And then there are other areas which are a sort of medium impact on the business, and there's a sort of a medium risk around getting it right. There's a degree of uncertainty around, well, this could work, that could work. You've got a few alternatives, different scenarios that you can go through. So this could be, forecasting into the future. It could be thinking about what the emphasis of the change process should be. Should we be dialing up fairness? Should we be dialing up psychological safety? Should we be dialing up goal setting? So these are things that we can go out and consult on. We've got some data maybe that kind of says, well, this is kind of what we think. And so maybe those decisions can be delegated and reviewed by a team. One example here was performance management meetings, for example. So how often do we have them? What do we say in them? We know we want them to happen, but how it's kind of done at the coalface, as it were, could be a matter of consultation, but you kind of have to do them. And then there's this sort of co-creation area where we don't know really what the impact is going to be. We don't understand what the risk is going to be, and there's a sense of ambiguity that potentially we have lots of information, but there is lots of potential for us to impose our own individual bias of what that information means if we don't go out and consult and make the wrong decisions. And we don't necessarily know what the alternatives are. We don't know what the outcomes are potentially going to be. And this is very much, this sort of VUCA world kind of thing. And here, we go out and co-create the future together. And one example of this could be, what are the organisational values, or what are the behaviours that we want to adopt to create the world that we want to live in, or the organisation that we want to live in. So that's just one framework that you could potentially use. And this is one that I was exposed to by Ian Coyle, who does a lot on bullying and duty of care within organisations. And it's this nice idea that if decisions don't go according to plan, then we could run through this sort of process of, what would have happened. So in terms of best practice, what would have happened if we'd have got this right. So we've been through a decision-making process. We got the decision wrong. So what would have happened in a sort of an ideal world, and then what could have happened within the restrictions of this decision, and what are the internal restrictions that stop us from making this sort of ideal choice. And then we can start to reflect on, okay, in the future, what should happen? What are we going to do about changing the process? And again, you remember in fair decision making, it's so important that we can go back and rectify decisions and go back and think about what went wrong with that decision. And I just thought this was a nice way of doing that. And also, when you're writing procedures for decision making or agreeing them, you're never going to get it 100% right for every single possible decision. So having a mechanism like this is so important that, hey, if we do really screw this up, we know what to do and review it and make the appropriate changes. So it's sort of like a meta process, I guess, for checking decisions are right. And of course, I'm going to say that you know, a really good decision-making process is an evidence-based one. And this is, again, another way in which we can make decisions, and it gives you a nice 6-step process. So we pull together lots of high-quality information from scientific research, from the organisation, from you as practitioners, from various stakeholders, and we bring it all together and we say, well, this is kind of what the organisation is telling us, this is what the evidence is telling us, and then you go through this 6-stage process of trying to translate the problem into a sort of practical issue that we can deal with. And then you go through, acquire the data, you appraise it to see how trustworthy it is, pull it all together, come up with an intervention, apply the intervention, and then assess whether it's worked. And that for me seems to be, that does your procedural justice piece, and it does your interactional and informational justice piece, because you're going out and consulting and gathering all these different sources of evidence. And if anybody was to challenge this process, you'd have a nice audit trail there as well in terms of the outcomes. So I think evidence-based practice in itself creates organisational fairness and justice. And you know, it does these other things which you know are all related to justice as well, and it gives this agility, you know, this balance between autonomy and structure, creates trust, empowers people, so you can actually run this decision-making process at any level in the organisation, creates congruence, because we know every time we're making the same decisions based on the same process. As I said, fairness and confidence in the business, which we know is so important for driving trust. And this is just what I use within organisations as well, to sort of say what behaviours will I see in an organisation if you're going in as a change practitioner. If there isn't fairness in decision making, you'll see silence in rooms when you try and ask people about how decisions are made, or you ask for their opinion. You'll see finger pointing and blame. You'll see people just, you know, arbitrarily breaking rules because the rules don't mean anything, because the procedure doesn't mean anything, because everybody breaks it. And potentially there's lack of trust, particularly in leadership, poor relationships on the ground, and you'll see that there'll be a history of poor decision making. And hopefully when we get it right, then we'll see that procedurally people become invested in the procedure, and they turn up to discuss what the decision is going to be, and they want to contribute to that. And you can see people gathering, you know, information and consulting and finding and challenging each other's bias and things. And you know, this outcome part, you'll see people justifying. They'll give you the rationale of why this decision has been made, because the process is very clear and the business case is very clear. And also informationally, you'll see people starting to speak up and communicating openly and candidly about decisions, and you'll see people treating each other with dignity and respect, or maybe even calling out each other's behaviours if you've got really strong psychological safety. So I think that's a nice sort of summary of what you hope to see kind of when you get it right. So, you know, the conclusion for me on all of this is not it's not rocket science, is it? It's not. It's actually quite obvious, and in our day-to-day lives, it's kind of what we expect. You know, for us, I guess we live in a democracy, and we kind of expect to be consulted on decisions, and when we're not, or they don't go our way, we tend to get annoyed and angry. So it should be, and it's not complex. It's fairly straightforward, and it's an emergent process if you've got that feedback loop to understand when poor decisions have been made. Yeah, it's just sound managerial practices, and it's the good thing about doing this is it's unlikely to be harmful. If you start talking about the process, it's not going to cause any detriment to the organisation. If anything, it's going to start challenging people about the way power is distributed in the organisation. And at the end of the day, you know, even if it's unsuccessful, you've still got a good foundation there to to learn from those mistakes and keep building a fair process. And I think even just by talking about we intend to be fair and this is how we do it will change people, that you don't even have to have made a decision. Just that being clear on the intent will create this feeling of organisational fairness in itself. Obviously, you're going to have to back that up with a process at some point. But I think if the intention is clear, then that will create the right perceptions. The upside is huge. I mean, this could potentially, of all the different constructs that you have to play with within organisational change, this one is, has got a proven, this and potentially psychological safety as well, has a real pedigree of research behind it that will drive your change process and make it successful. And at the end of the day, we all want to work in organisations and all want to treat people with dignity and in a humane way. And as we know, organisational change is about being sort of human-centred, and I think this is one of the key starting points. So that's it. That was a whiz through, whistle-stop tour of organisational fairness. So how was that?
First of all, thanks. That was really thorough. As you say towards the end, when you look at each of the constituent parts, none of it individually is rocket science, but the way that you've pulled that together and compressed it into the single session is an overall view on it I've not seen presented that way before. So that was really useful. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. And and hopefully there's some sort of practical stuff you can take away. Any other thoughts? Anything that I've missed or you'd like me to focus on?
It's Ken here. Hi. It's really good. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for doing that. I know a lot of work goes into this. In your experience, do you see any tools or techniques for improving the organisational decision making? Is there anything that you see a best practice for improving transparency behind decision making in organisations, for instance?
Well, I think the first step is sort of categorising decisions that you want to make, and which ones are, you remember the 3 C's, the comply and the consult and the co-create. I think sort of putting decisions into buckets and being very clear on which decisions you're going to put out there for consultations and which ones you're not and why you're not, and making sure that people accept that. I think there's a whole ton of stuff on voice. So I think whilst you're doing that, you can start building mechanisms for giving people voice, and they can have voice in where they think which buckets these decisions go into. So I think, yeah, there's and also I think you could potentially start revisiting, particularly as you're going into an organisation, you're a practitioner, and saying, right, well, we tried this change before, we've done something before and the decision didn't go down well, and revisiting that and trying to unpick and understand what happened there. I think as a sort of a lessons learned thing. I think all those are good starting points, if that helps.
Do you see any organisations, or in your experience for the organisations you're working with, do you actually come across any which are quite transparent on their decision making? I can put my video on. Sorry, I can put more. Yeah,
so I mean, a large charity. I did quite a bit of work with Amnesty, for example, who are very much into open decision making. That's kind of their reason for living, really. And so they were very interested in this. A large pharmaceutical company as well, that they very much want to be seen as being open and transparent and making the right decisions, and because pharmaceutical companies don't have a very good reputation. So I think when you and particularly I guess in the public sector as well, when I've worked in the public sector, when there are strong union representation, they really like this stuff, and they really like the idea of voice, and they want to be part of that voice and part of the decision-making process. So I think it works in a, you know, in a variety of different organisations and scenarios, and I just think there's just a general movement, isn't there, within organisations to treat people with more dignity and respect, particularly after COVID-19 and the whole sort of well-being, duty of care. Safeguarding is a big issue in public sectors, particularly in health as well, within the NHS. So yeah, I think there's lots of potential for you to sell this.
I think it's just that once you make decision making quite transparent, or even the sort of ingredients that go into decisions being made, and different perspectives, it's quite brave, isn't it, to put yourself out there to make it transparent along for executives, for example. I mean, you know, being able to see exactly how they've gone about making decisions and the options they've considered in that decision making, and who's been involved in that decision making, and the different perspectives that they've captured in going through those decision making. I think that's quite a brave position for an organisation to put itself into, because you're open to a lot of scrutiny then, and then that takes away a lot of the mystery along some of those positions, executive positions, for instance. That's
yeah. And I know the Financial Conduct Authority want to see in organisations how people who are governing that organisation open themselves up to be challenged from the organisation internally. Do you know what I mean? So they want to see how those mechanisms work. So particularly if you're going into a highly regulated financial sector, for instance, then there's a legal requirement for having proper governance, and this is basic proper governance, isn't it? But yeah, your question as well is also interesting. If I'm a leader and I'm not making decisions anymore, what am I doing? And I think it throws up that question, doesn't it, about so what are you doing when everything is very transparent and people can make quite a lot of the decisions within an organization? What is your role? And I think that's a big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer.
Okay.
But great. Okay. Well, I'll end it there. I know you've all got other meetings to go to and stuff, but thank you so much for coming and being present and asking great questions. And the next session is on psychological safety. I can't remember the date, but catch up on LinkedIn, and they're all listed there.
Thank you. Will you share the slides at all? It's good to get to digest it, or is there a
well, if you put your email in the chat, I can send them to you. I always post these on LinkedIn, so they'll be shared on SlideShare, and the video will be shared as well.
Sorry, we're in contact often, so I shall get them from LinkedIn then. Thank you.
All right, brilliant. Thanks, Lorraine.
Cheers, bye.
Thanks, Robert. Cheers, Ken.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.